Okay, just as a note, given the semester is somewhere so far beyond screwed up, can you see it with the telescope? Just a reminder that, of course, you've got there's less than 2 weeks left in the semester. So, you know, clock's ticking. If someone tries to give me like the first one or two of the critical thinking papers because I haven't done them, I don't know of anyone that's actually around that I've seen in our sessions that has it. I'm not going to accept stuff from September anymore. That was like now it's very much this, especially given this semester, that's like ancient history now. So do get your stuff done. If you've got video reactions, I guess I'll accept those. I'll be a little irritated, but I'll take really late ones of those. But do get your work done because it's not even a clock ticking. It's basically the semester is for all intents and purposes almost out. In reality, you basically got 1 week left, 1 week and a little couple of days. So just be warned. So like one of those FYIs on like how many days till Christmas type stuff. Okay, what I wanted to do is finish off on the Filipinos because I thought I'd actually spread the semester out well, but I'm realizing that it's actually going to be sort of short about a week, so I'm going to sort of have to scrunch stuff here. When you're looking at the Filipinos, I mentioned that it's really important. In fact, it's really central to understand the Philippines is a very, very complicated place. Now, after the question I had earlier, it's not unique. Indonesia is even more ethnically complicated than the Philippines. Indonesia has such a complex mix of religions and cultures and stuff like that. It's sort of mind-blowing. So all of Southeast Asia is not like Japan or Korea, or even to a large extent China, where your Han, your ethnic Chinese are a huge majority of the population. Throughout all what's now called Southeast Asia, all those places are incredibly diverse. Very few of them actually have a particularly dominant percentage in a particular ethnic group. In Thailand, the Thai are by far the dominant majority, I think 70%. And Vietnam, ethnic Vietnamese are about 80%. Well, especially after the Vietnam War, probably more like 90%. But most of the rest of the area is just, there's like a whole slew of different types of people in there from different backgrounds. So the Philippines is not unique in that regard. It's very typical of that region. But that becomes really important to understand because that motivates some of the migration to Hawaii, is that diversity. And it also motivates the Philippines, especially government reactions to migration. When you're looking at the period 1900 to basically World War II, in other words, 1941, because the Philippines was a colony of the United States, like Hawaii, Guam, etc., then free travel was allowed between colonies. Having said that, the mainland United States, of course, who are having a good old time being in the middle of their yellow peril thing, especially because you have to remember, this is like the Massey Jameson period, it's pre-World War II. They didn't want Filipinos everywhere around. Filipinos on the mainland were heavily restricted. There were all sorts of regulations against Filipinos immigrating to the mainland United States. When in that pact, I think you still hear occasionally people will call this the states, which means the mainland 48 states, which of course was the states in pre-1959. So the mainland United States didn't want Filipinos. And they, of course, as I mentioned last time, they just packaged them as Asian. They didn't see any distinction between them, Chinese, Japanese, etc. What really pissed off the mainland, however, is there were large numbers of the Filipino population that came here that tried to find work in the plantations, and especially by the late 1920s, which, as I mentioned last time, the plantations have become much more technologically sophisticated. So they needed a technologically sophisticated workforce. They didn't need some illiterate guy who could whack cane with a machete. They needed someone who could repair machinery or could run a backhoe or heavy equipment or drive a truck. And so when they were recruiting from the Philippines, that's one reason why the plantations tend to recruit the same guys. They might spend some money and investing some money in training the guy once, but they didn't want to have to do that over 5 or 10 years. So when unionization finally takes hold and the plantations start having to pay people more money, finally pay them a real wage, they're much more motivated to basically recruit from the same pool of already trained people. So this sort of becomes a closed shop. So if you're Filipino and you come over here in like 1927, you're going to have a hell of a hard time finding a job because there aren't a lot of jobs outside of the plantations. The jobs that are there require skill sets. If they're local jobs, they require competency in local versions of English and stuff. And there's not very much in the way of service sector jobs. You have to remember the tourism sector hasn't started up yet. So a lot of the Filipinos that come over here from, basically making 1920 to say 1940, who aren't coming back, or coming over here first time, then try to move on to the U.S. mainland where they can find service sector jobs. So they're competing with Latinos populations, African Americans, other folks who are either minority groups who are providing all the service jobs. In the 1920s or 1930s, I don't remember when, at least in California, and I believe also, someone told me also in Washington State, if you had money, it became very stylish to have Filipino servants. They used to call the guys houseboys. I don't know where that comes from, but I remember hearing there's actually, the French use that for, and the British use that for Chinese servants in the 19th century. So I think it's actually an older sort of European term for sort of folks who are like butlers but weren't that important. So it was the folks that did like, cooking or washing clothes or something like that were called houseboys, or maids was the female version. In the mainland United States, it became very popular in the 20s and 30s to have Filipinos do that. I think in part because since the Filipinos spoke English, and they're coming from at least from the groups that we have here, coming from a Christian background, the mainland Haole population that could afford them saw them as vastly more attractive than Chinese, Japanese, and some other group who one wasn't Christian in most cases, didn't speak English, and was even more part of this sort of, Asian terrifying yellow peril stereotype. So there was sort of a big demand for Filipinos in those jobs. But in other sectors of the U.S. mainland economy, there wasn't, because they were competing with Haoles and other folks for those jobs. There was no labor shortage. In fact, after 1929, with the Great Depression, there were basically no jobs in the mainland at all. The whole COVID thing, now it's important to remember the job rate today is still better than it was during the Great Depression. And that wasn't a temporary phenomenon related to a virus. That was just a world economic collapse. So what happened is the Filipinos are coming over in the 20s and 30s frequently see Hawaii as a staging place to go onto the mainland, but they usually find themselves slapped into back here because the mainland won't accept them and shoves them back. In fact, there are a couple of states, including California and I believe Oregon, that actually sued the U.S. government's state or interior department, whatever department used to run territories. I think that's the interior department, I guess, and actually sued them to make them not allow Filipinos to get on boats to go to the mainland. In other words, if you can want to recruit Filipinos in Hawaii, that's fine, but you've got to make sure that they don't leave unless they're going back to the Philippines. And this was a big issue on the mainland in the 20s and especially the 30s with the economic collapse of the Great Depression. So the world that the Filipinos came into here was not the world of the folks that came over earlier. The job situation vis-a-vis the plantations was totally different. Of course, by 1930, the Great Depression had hit Hawaii too. So jobs basically vanished here also. So no one was interested in someone who comes over with fairly limited job skills, fairly, limited command of English, and is willing to work for anything. By 1930, maybe a quarter of the population of the United States is willing to work for anything. So why should you invite someone from outside in? And so the Filipinos don't have the same, they're not moving into the same world here that the Japanese or even the Okinawans or Koreans were, maybe 10, 20 years before them. And then that has a huge thing to do with the Filipino population here. That probably also motivated them again to go back to the Philippines after a while. If they couldn't find good work here, couldn't find consistent work, go back to the Philippines, get stuff sort of sorted out and then make another try of it a few years later back here. So that rotating labor pool is a really important part of the phenomena here, because that, as I mentioned last time, that really impacts this whole idea of assessment of assimilation. You just don't have that same need of assimilation because you don't really see Hawaii as ever being your permanent home. It's your temporary work residence. Now, what this actually does is this is the first stage of what we now call remittance economies. This is a technical term. I can't remember. It was generated by geographers, but I can't remember who. In the 1950s, when they were looking at the idea that you actually get labor groups migrating en masse. In other words, large numbers of people moving somewhere with the sole idea that they're sending money back home. Now, this is different than the 19th century because in the 19th century, one, it was done by individuals. With the exception of the Japanese a little bit, governments weren't really involved in it, and it really wasn't organized. It was pretty much just individuals, trying to get their ass out before it hit, or families throwing someone out of the house and saying, congratulations, you're going to Hawaii because we're starving. What you get by the 1950s, 1960s, especially by the late 1960s, one, U.S. immigration law has lessened. Immigration laws globally have lessened. Your colonial empires are pretty much gone. You're starting to get more of a distribution of resources and jobs, globally, rather than being located pretty much in Europe and the US. And also you start to get the idea of global financing, with the idea that you've got ways to move money around fairly easily. Then what you see is you start to see what we call remittance economies, where countries that have labor excess, like the Philippines, like India, like Indonesia, start to actually see that pool of labor as being something they can actually use in the same way that you can make an iPhone or grow crops or something else. In other words, they see it as an economic engine. And so they actually sponsor this. The Philippines right now is one of the biggest remittance economy systems. And remittance just means you send money back to your family. But the government takes a cut of that. And the government, of course, then taxes the family when they spend the money in country. So by the 1960s, 70s, the Philippines economy started to see people as what they were actually producing. The Philippines has never been particularly successful in bringing in factories. They have the labor for it. I'm not sure why, but I think it was just government policies. It just didn't happen. So unlike Vietnam or other places, they were never able to draw in production. So by the same time Vietnam, for example, is drawing in production, the Philippines is saying, well, if we can't have factories, we'll send people out. But this time it's the government actually doing it all en masse. I can never remember what the actual number of Filipinos working in the Middle East is, but it's huge. If you go to Hong Kong, you find that the huge part of the population that's not Chinese is Filipino maids, chauffeurs, and stuff like that. My in-laws in China have, I believe, 5 Filipinos working for them. 1 driver, 2 or 3 working in the house, and then 1 nanny. And that's typical. They're just upper middle class. That's very typical in Hong Kong. If you're successful in Hong Kong, you have Filipino servants. And a lot of those folks have worked for him. I think the drivers worked for him for almost 30 years. So that's actually become, and that's set up by the government. The Philippines actually has work agencies in Manila that recruit you to work in Hong Kong or recruit you to work in Dubai. And Indonesia's done the same thing. So they basically see people as being what they produce, and that's sort of what they sell, if you want to think of it that way. And so what happens is post-World War II, when this starts to happen, that changes things radically, because all of a sudden the government's now involved in actually shipping labor out and basically recruiting. Do you want cheap labor? Here we've got this group of people and they speak English, so they're willing to work hard. Boom. And they need it. Philippines economy, I believe, is roughly 37% of the economy is based entirely on money sent back home. The government would collapse probably within 30 minutes if suddenly that money stopped. Indonesia is about the same, 30-something%. As we'll see when we get into Pacific Island groups, in Samoa, it's roughly 80% of the economy is based on remittances sent back home. In Tonga, it's almost 90%. Tonga basically has no other money coming into the country outside of, like New Zealand government giving them money, with the exception of people from outside of Tonga. Tongans sending money back to family in Tonga. So by the 70s, 80s, and certainly by the 90s, your Polynesian and Micronesian populations in the Pacific take the same model as the Philippines and just, completely expand it off the charts. There is no money coming into Micronesia with the exception of US government aid, other than money sent back by relatives. So what happens is this changes things radically. And of course, Hawaii would have been a big part of that, but post-World War II, the plantations are dead. There is no plantation anymore. And again, remember, they still needed skilled labor. They don't need someone to be a driver or a maid. They need someone who can run heavy equipment or, can fix an engine. So what happened is that never happened. By the late 60s, early 70s, when tourism finally starts to really ramp up here, then the tourist business, i.e. the hotels and other places involved in tourism, they actually go to the Philippines and actually say, we can use, people that are willing to work cheap to do various jobs in the hotel industry or, service sector industry related to tourism. And that becomes the draw. And that's why you see the large Filipino migration post-World War II. But it's a very, very different population. One, it's part of the country of the Philippines now. It's not an American colony. You've had roughly 20 to 30 years, if they're coming over here by the 70s or 80s, of being taught that the Philippines is a ethnic government that's based largely on Tagalog values and attitudes, which they call Filipino. So it's a very different population than someone who came over from Ilocos Sud province or from the Visayan group in, say, 1920. In that regard, they're very similar to the Okinawans or, say, the Chinese, where they might come from the same place, but they're 2 radically different populations just because of history and political change back home. So when you're looking at Filipinos, it's important to remember which group is a very different type of thing. Excuse me. Another part of this then is what you have is like the Chinese, but then the Chinese are not a particularly large population here. They're highly visible, but the number of new Chinese migrating over is not huge, and unless like me, you spend a lot of time in Chinatown. But Filipinos are a large group. They're very visible. They're very involved in the service sector, so they're highly visible. And this makes things rather complicated because, of course, you still have basically two entirely separate groups of Filipinos. You have the Filipino population that's a result of the 1910 to 1941 migration and their children and grandchildren, and by now great-great-grandchildren, if you would, the local Filipinos. Now you've also got a large group of Filipinos that come over basically from the 1970s on, and the Filipinos are still one of the fastest, largest groups in terms of in-migration to Hawaii right now. And that's an entirely different group. The two groups, physically look similar because they're both from the Philippines and they're from the same area. They're both still either Ilocanos or now a lot more Tagalog, but they're not actually very similar to each other. And that's because one group is local that happens to have been, ethnically from that area. They're much more liable to identify with being Tagalog, Ilocanos, or something like that. The second group is going to come over here. They might come over here a couple of years ago. They're working in the hotel industry, and there's sort of the classic FOB or fresh off the boat migrant. Different accent, different attitude, different way of doing stuff. And they're part of, the Filipino world of the 21st century. Now, this is also exacerbated, of course, by something we hadn't seen before. And that's that, of course, when the Filipinos are coming over here recently, there's the enormous changes in technology. You guys would see this once the COVID thing sort of dies down. If you flash back, if you remember last semester or last year, everyone all the time was walking around with their hands on their phone, interacting with their social media. And what that means in many cases, and this was true of the Filipinos coming over here in the last 15, 20 years, you can be here, but you can still watch Filipino shows on TV. You can be here and still do the things that you did back home. Now, what this means is, a large part of assimilation, again, I mentioned this a bunch of times, but assimilation is not something people want to do. People occasionally will move somewhere else and they want to assimilate, sort of. I see this with British expats in Hong Kong, for example. But they still, a lot of the time, they want to eat their comfort food. They still want British food. They want to watch British TV shows. They want to hear people speaking English. So on one hand, they might be sort of trying to adapt to Hong Kong, but it's really, really hard to assimilate. And many of you have gone through that in your lives. It's a very stressful, very not rewarding phenomena, because in most cases, you're never going to be accepted as local. You're not part of that group. You're obviously from the outside. And so it's, you have to. So it's forced on you. So if you're Chinese and you come over here in 1880, you have to learn English. You have to learn Pidgin. You're not going to see, read Chinese books or do Chinese stuff because you can't. If you're Filipino and you come over here in 1920, same thing's true. There's one Filipino newspaper, I think, here on Honolulu. But you have to learn Pidgin. You're going to have to learn how to speak English. And you're going to have to learn how to eat different types of food. And it's going to be relatively hard to find your home food, your comfort food, all that type of stuff. You come over here in 2016, and you come over here, but because of your phone, because of the internet and other stuff like that, you don't really have to leave the Philippines. Emotionally, you can still be in the Philippines. You can still talk with your family every minute of every day. You can still hang out with your friends. You guys are doing it right now. COVID's been sort of interesting because it's put everyone in that situation. The only thing you're missing is your comfort food, but it's even easier to get that. So in the 21st century, because of the changes in technology, people really don't have to move emotionally and cognitively. They can physically be somewhere else, but they're not actually there. And then you see this Chaminade being the campus that it is. This is why you see everyone like this. They're walking around on campus, but they're still speaking Chokese or Samoan or Tagalog to someone else. So even though they're here on campus with you, they're not actually here emotionally. They're not actually here conceptually. They're still worried about if their friends are going to break up. They're still worried about what their family's doing. Is their auntie still going nuts or being, goofy or whatever? And all that type of stuff is more important than the people are actually physically next to. And what this means is it becomes very difficult to assimilate because the population you moved in with, i.e. the local population here, is not going to cut you a lot of slack. If you persist in speaking the way that you spoke and acting the way that you acted, and basically making it pretty clear that you don't want to really be a part of here, so you're not going to commit to it. If you're not going to, if you're not going to commit to people, they're going to say, well, screw you, we're not going to commit to you either. Why should we put up with you wanting to be different if you're not willing to adjust to us when you live here? If you don't want to be different, then go home. And to a certain extent, when you do that, you're sort of saying, this isn't home. This is a big issue globally. And it's a huge issue. The Filipinos are the first group that actually see that, not in Filipinos in total, what you might call sort of the fresh off the boat Filipinos of the last decade. That's very, very true, because they don't really have to adapt to Hawaii. They don't lose any. The only problem they have is they can't actually physically be with their family or friends, but they can still interact with them 24/7, 365. So, why do they going to try to find local friends here? Why are they going to get to know people here more? They might occasionally, but there's not the same need, because you can basically have these sort of, crash, like crash protectors, basically, that basically mean you don't really have to adapt to a place. We're starting to realize that anthropology is going to be one of the huge problems of the 21st century. If you move somewhere else, but you don't really have to adapt to that place, then that place is going to have very little tolerance for you. And to be honest, I can sort of see both sides of it, but I'm sorry, if you move to someplace else, they write the rules, they write the book, it's their game. You don't go on a football field and decide you want to play rugby. You can, but I don't expect the rest of the football team to sit there and go, oh, okay, we'll do what you want. That ain't going to happen. So it's unrealistic. And sad to say, in the 21st century right now, with the technology we have, it's incredibly easy to do. And the Filipino recent migrants are probably one of the first really highly visible groups. Now, what that does is that makes life very complicated if you're actually ethnically Filipino here, because on one hand, you might be third or fourth generation, population. Your great grandpa came over in 1917, maybe, so you're totally local. But if someone here local is interacting with you, and someone else walks up next to you and they just got off the boat 7 years ago, but they're still speaking with a really heavy accent. They're obviously entirely tied to their family back in the Philippines because of social media. And they just sort of see Hawaii as sort of a hassle and a way to make work and get a job. And they don't really feel that they're trying to adapt to this place. Then your larger local population is going to put you both in the same box, unless you can actually prove that you're not. So as we'll see, this is a problem with a lot of the recent groups. It's also true, for example, of the Chinese. But there aren't that many Chinese, they aren't as visible, and your local Chinese community is so integrated into being local here that it's very easy to make the distinction between someone who's obviously Chinese fresh off the boat and someone who's been here since like 1879. So Filipino population has that. One of the other things you can find with the Filipino population is they don't have access to the same labor needs. There aren't the same, as I mentioned earlier, there aren't the same constant demands for, cheap labor that are willing to do anything that gives people that are just sort of trying to start out a way to get ahead. It's also much more complicated nowadays to marry into the local population because the population pool here is much larger. It's much more diverse. So if you're Filipino and you come over post-World War II, the local population pretty much has become a little more insular, and it's in many ways sort of identifies itself with the plantation period. And so the new migrants don't have the same easy access, by virtue of that. They don't have the same ability, for example, to move on to the land and such. So the world radically changes by the 1930s when the plantations cease to be part of the system. And the Filipinos are probably the group that gets caught most betwixt and between, simply because one, they're the last big group arriving during the plantation period, and two, they're the largest group arriving after the plantation period. Okay, yeah, a couple of the values. Many of the Filipino value systems are exactly the same as the other groups we've seen. I'm not going to get into differences between Visayan, Tagalog, and Ilocanos. There are a lot of differences. I'm not at all an expert at all on any of the Filipino groups. I'm fairly familiar with the Ilocanos population. Visayans, I've never seen any particular good amount of literature. In fact, if you look at it, you'll find there's actually very little literature on Filipinos in the United States in general, and there's very little literature on Filipinos in Hawaii. There's one or two histories and a couple of stuff like that, but in terms of actually looking at the social, cultural dynamics, ethnic identity, and stuff like that, nothing. And I've seen absolutely no work done on the tensions between local Filipinos and what you might call fresh off the boat Filipinos, or maybe pre-World War II and in 1970s, et cetera. I've seen absolutely nothing done on that. So when you're looking at these, I'm just going to use sort of the generic stuff, since that's oftentimes that's what you see in what little there is in the literature. One of the things that's really different, and by this I'm going to largely define by Tagalog, since this isn't true really of Ilocanos, but Tagalogs are one of the largest groups here, and of course they are in the modern Philippines, they are seen as the stereotype. Tagalog society is really interesting because it's one of the few societies, in fact, just about the only one we have here, outside of what you might call mainland Anglo-Americans, that actually has a tradition of a bilateral kinship. All the other groups here are unilineal. You trace descent through one side of the family. And with almost no, as well, when we want to get into Micronesians, there's a little exception, but with all the other groups, it's largely males. So women move into the husband's family. It's a traditional American thing. A couple gets married, and when the wedding's done, they say, I introduce you to Mr. and Mrs., and the woman will have taken the husband's name. That's a patrilineal system. Women move into men's families. That's true of almost all the groups here. It's certainly the Asian norm. Tagalogs are different, and I'm not sure particularly what this is, why though I have suspicions, in that it's bilateral. So you trace descent through both men and women. Men are more important, but not really, there's no exclusivity there. And if you remember when I was talking about Koreans, that's probably the extreme example. Women give up all the rights to their family when they marry into a guy's family, to the extent that their family won't take them back if something happens to the guy. That's about as far down the patrilineal route as you can get. Tagalog society tends to be much more sort of balanced. Now, on one hand, you might think, well, that gives you two groups of relatives, so you should have a lot more relatives because you're tracing descent through your dad's side of the family and your mom's side of the family. The reality is with bilateral kinships is that you change from the system that you see in Asian societies, and us actually also, well, to a certain extent in Polynesian societies, to something that's very typical of what you see in Anglo-American society. Asian societies and Pacific Island societies, at least in Polynesia, are what we call contractual. And again, the classic example would be Chinese. And again, I'm pretty sure I mentioned this. If I'm dealing with my Chinese in-laws, we identify each other by virtue of our relationship with the family. So as I'm pretty sure I mentioned before, my nephews and nieces call me Jern Jern, which means that I'm their mother's sister's husband. So I'm their uncle on the mom's side. And that's actually the Cantonese for that particular position. So you don't use someone's name, you use actually their position, their position on the genealogy chart relative to you. Now what that means is if I'm Jern Jern, if I'm uncle, then that's a contractual relationship. I have to treat all of my nephews and nieces the same. I can't have a favorite nephew or favorite niece. If I do, there'll be a large amount of family pressure to cut that out. So for example, at New Year's, you give leasee. You always have to give the same amount of leasee to all your nephews and nieces. You can't give one more because they're your fave. That's a contractual relationship. Now this makes life pretty easy. Well, on one hand, it makes life a real hassle, because if you've got a bunch of nieces and nephews, that means you have to do the same thing. So you have to be very careful when you're thinking about something. If one of them asks for a favor, then you realize that all the other ones can ask for the same favor, and you have to give it to them. You can't say, oh no, I just did that for so-and-so because they needed it. That's not relevant. It's a contractual relationship. The word uncle means this. The word niece and nephew means that. This relationship is that relationship, and it's just like a contract. And that's the way Asian relationships work, and that's the way Polynesian relationships work. They're contractual. The great advantage to those is if someone identifies himself by a position, you know immediately what the obligations are. So you don't have to PR someone or negotiate it. It is what it is because that's what it is. And so that's the key advantage of contractual relationships that make life real uncomplicated in terms of figuring out how people are supposed to act and actually the normative responsibilities for behavior. They're not particularly useful when it comes to trying to get stuff out of people, because in many cases someone might say no when they want to say yes, but they've got 18 nephews and nieces and they can't afford to do the same thing for all 18 of them. So contractual is the Asian norm, contractual is the Polynesian norm. When you go to bilateral kinship, which is what you would see in mainland Anglo-American society, what you're looking at is bilateral, and in that situation, what you find is relationships become negotiated. So if you want to think about it this way, if you're Chinese, if you look at your scoring, you got two folks here. You got one guy who's ethnically Chinese here, and you got another person who's sort of ethnically Anglo-American here. The ethnic Chinese guy should have a smaller kinship group because they only trace descent largely through their male side of the family. The Haole guy next to him, it should be tracing descent through both sides. So she have, think about it, should have twice as many relatives. You got the dad's side of the family and the mom's side of the family, so it's additive. what you're going to find almost invariably is in bilateral kinship system, people have less relatives. It's very typical in the U.S. mainland. I remember this growing up. If you actually ask outside of the Native American part of the family, no one knew who second cousins were. We wouldn't know a second cousin if they suddenly showed up on the doorstep. And most importantly, if they did show up on the doorstep, other than being interested in the fact they were a second cousin, there's no obligation. In Chinese society, if I show up and I'm a second cousin, you're obliged to, take me to the house, to feed me, to help me get sorted out if I moved over there recently, and to do a fair amount of stuff for me because there's a contractual relationship between second cousins. In a bilateral negotiated relationship, it's only if I like that person. I don't have to do anything for a second cousin. The society's not going to disown me. My relatives aren't going to disown me. I mean, if anything, even my friends would go, second cousins. Damn, I don't know any of my second cousins. Yeah. Why would you have to do something for them? Okay, it's not. So you don't add relatives. Actually, your relative pool shrinks. This is what you see to a certain extent in Tagalog families. Now, they're still extended families, so they're still much larger than the Anglo-American nuclear family. But the set of relatives is not defined by a genealogy chart. It's defined by personal relationships. So in Tagalog society, having relationships with people is absolutely central to calling them relatives. You have to know them, you have to interact with them, you have to, if you would, PR them, because then by acknowledging that relationship, they then can be called relatives. You can't go and bang on someone's door and say, hey, I'm your cousin, you got to help me out. They're just going to look at you like, maybe, but maybe not. If it's your fault that you didn't interact with them for 20 years, why are they suddenly going to help you out now? So in that regard, it's more similar to Anglo-American society than it is to what you see with most of the other Asian groups. If it makes it really complicated, Ilocanos are classically Asian. Okay. So bilateral kinship is different, but most importantly, it changes social dynamics. In Chinese society, Japanese society, and all the rest of these groups, you can be pretty brutal about your relationships with relatives because because it's contractual, there's not a lot they can do about it. To a certain extent, I don't know if I want to call it take advantage of it, but you can certainly just assume that if you need something, it's going to happen. And I know, for example, with my Chinese in-laws, both the Hanai family and the marriage family, stuff moves around all the time. I think I mentioned before, I still have a car on Maui. Well, I'm sure the car is busted up by now, but my nephew needed it on Maui, and I had a car when I was working over on Maui, so I just left it with him. It's a car, and it belongs to me, but it's also part of the family. We're not doing it right now, but we're always moving furniture in and out of our house because the houses and actually the furniture in them belong to the Chinese in-laws. They belong to the relatives. They belong to the family. If a relative needs a bed more, then a bed disappears. If someone needs a chair more, then the chair disappears. If we need a chair, then all of a sudden, pump, a chair shows up. There's not this idea of them and there's not the idea of us and me. The me is the us. And that's part of a contractual relationship oftentimes is the idea that you don't have this idea of individual ownership. In negotiated relationships, there's a much stronger sense of me, the idea of I as an individual. So it's my chair, it's my bed, it's my stuff, it's my house. I can choose to share it out, but that becomes a choice that I get to define by virtue of the relationships I see I have with other people. So you're going to spend a lot more time working those relationships with relatives to make sure that people will be there when you need them. And you're also going to be a little more suspicious of relationships that people try to cook up when it's pretty obvious they want something out of you. In a contractual thing, it doesn't make any difference if you know that they're trying to milk you or not. If you're their uncle, you just got to put up with it because that's life in the big city and being Chinese. So negotiating and contractual relationships make for incredibly different social dynamics. It's not by surprise when you think about it, the Chinese system, people don't celebrate Christmas. Why would they? You don't need gifts to reinforce the relationships. You don't need Christmas cards to reinforce relationships because the relationships are defined. In American society, you have to have Christmas cards and gifts because you have to reinforce those people are important to you. Otherwise, they'll just sort of check you off the list and you vanished. And this is one reason why Americans tend to have very small packages of kin. And oftentimes those kin don't bear a lot of relationship to all the people that could be kin. And that's this idea of negotiated relationships. So Tagalog society is much closer to the Anglo sort of American stereotype. Now, what this also means then is if your family relationships are defined by the one that they're relatives and two, this kinship system, but it's also going to be in some cases pretty manipulative, not necessarily, but it can be. What you're going to find is there's still a real desire to have a relationship which is entirely based on someone liking you and being comfortable with you as you are. So if you would, a very clear, I don't know how to describe it in English, clear relationship, uncomplicated, maybe that's the way to do it. This obviously existed in Tagalog society prior to the Spanish. The Spanish actually have something very similar because the Spanish have a very patrilineal, but it's a very contractual relationship in the Spanish system. And the Spanish have a term for this, it's called compadre, which is oftentimes translated in English into friend. But if you grew up speaking Spanish, compadre isn't friend. Compadre is a really different word. Compadre is a much more heavily loaded, it's a much more complicated word than friend. Its closest parallel would be soulmate / best friend. Tagalog society picks up, or it has whatever it had before after 300 years of the Spanish being around. Compadre becomes a really fascinating relationship that's absolutely central for much of Tagalog society, and now it's pretty much become pan-Filipino. You see it also in the Ilocanos society a lot. And there's the thing about it is these compadres are not necessarily kin. When I was living on Kauai, for example, our next door neighbor was 2 guys and a woman. They were all Ilocanos. The one was a husband and wife, the lady and her husband. The other guy was the compadre of the husband. And all 3 of them lived together. And for a while, I grew up in a system like this, so I sort of had some idea what was going on, but it was hard to figure it out initially. I couldn't figure out what the hell was going on with 3 people living in one house like that. Since they're obviously pretty close, but the 2 guys were closer to each other than they were to the woman. And that's a compadre relationship. A compadre is someone that you become incredibly emotionally close to, and those 2, you and they resonate in some way. They are, again, soulmates, the closest thing I can think of in bad English. And so they don't have to be your relative. They might be. Not uncommonly, they might be a cousin or an uncle or some other sort of vague relative. But the social relationship is absolutely central. You'll frequently see this at some point. This might be the person who becomes your godfather, something like that. But that's not quite. There's not necessarily an overlay there. But that person is in many ways emotionally the most important person to you. Compadres are frequently same sex. So the guys, in many cases, guys will have a guy as a compadre, women will have a woman as a compadre. And this can make life complicated because oftentimes compadres, especially with the earlier group that came over in the 20s and 30s, the compadres were found when they were working on the plantations before they actually set up shop and got married and set up a family here, like what I saw. So compadre relationships are not the same as a kin relationship. Compadre is an entirely different thing, which is a person. It's very much a me thing. The compadre is tied to you as a person. They're not interested in the rest of your family. They might not even have any relationship with the rest of your family. Their interest is in you, and your interest is in them. It's a very, very intimate, close emotional bond, which is very typical in areas the Spanish controlled. You see very much the same thing while I grew up in a migrant Mexican neighborhood. You'll see the same word, compadre, which is, of course, a Spanish word. You see the same type of relationships. And until you're used to them, they can be pretty confusing because they can be people very different in age, can be same sex, can be different sex. There's no principle that applies it except these folks are incredibly close. This is a very, very key social relationship in Tagalog, and I'd argue in many cases now in Filipino societies, the idea of the compadre. And it tends to be an entirely separate thing from your kin relationships. Might be part of the same person, but they're not the same type of thing at all. You don't see this with the other groups here in Hawaii. They don't have that type of a unique person-to-person social bond with one particular individual like that. So it's one of the more fascinating aspects of what was obviously Tagalog and became Hispanized with the Spanish coming in, sort of put a new label on, if you would. And in some ways, one of the reasons you see this as a contrast is the Filipinos that come over here, the Zacatecans that come over here, and the work that comes over here pre-World War II, and actually the group after that. If you talk to Filipinos, like one of my neighbors who's been here for 17 or 18 years, I think he's been here, he constantly vents on this. And this is the fact that the folks that came over here, when the Hawaiianos were recruiting, if you remember the guy in the white suit in the car, when they're coming over here in the early part of the 20th century, of course, he's selling that to those Ilocanos guys in that little village by saying, look what I did for 3 years. I made all this money. I've got this car, the suit, I've got a driver, all this type of stuff like that. And of course, knowing full well the Ilocanos guys are going to think, oh man, we can kick some butt because we're a lot better workers than the Tagalogs are. So what you get is this stereotype is very strong for the Filipino group then, and actually still now, that the United States / Hawaii is basically rolling in money. And if you come over here, it's a pretty fast, pretty easy way to make a lot of money compared to what you would make in the Philippines, or even, for example, say in Hong Kong or something. So one of the side effects of that is that pushes the migration over here. People are constantly trying to get over here and make that big killing, to make all that money, to then send back home. One of the other side effects of this, and this sort of goes back to, again, if you remember that weird story about the Korean guys, is that the guy over here, or now, of course, it could be the woman over here, that send money back home, the family back home gets really used to having that money show up. They really like having that money show up. And because so much of the Philippines is a remittance economy, that might pretty much be the only money showing up. The family's obviously got a farm or something like that, but pretty much that's like subsistence level. The only money to pay for schooling, to pay for the daughter's coming of age ceremony, for a wedding or a funeral or anything like that, that's the money being brought in from overseas, which in many cases would be the Sakatas over here. So they're sort of seen as like a welfare check, or I don't know what you want to call it, more like a trust fund, maybe. It's like money, it's money in the bank you can depend on. And because of the stereotype of Hawaii, which is still prevalent in much of the Philippines today, that there's a ton of money over here, and it's just, if you got any sort of creative ability, it's just a matter of sort of grabbing hold of it. Then there's an attitude that no matter how much I send back, if I'm one of these Sakatas, on the money, it's just like if you get a pay raise. If suddenly you get a 20% pay raise, okay, for a month or two, it's really great. You've got more money coming in. But I can guarantee within 5 or 6 months, you're going to get used to it. And that's become your normal wage now. So what happened is when the families back home is, despite me sending money back, after a couple of years of that, they've gotten used to having that money. And now their expectations for the type of things they can afford, the type of things they want to do. So for example, it's the second daughter's coming of age ceremony, and they want it to be better than the first daughter's because now they've gotten used to having money, and their neighbors had a really nice ceremony, and they want to make sure that their ceremony looks better. And so what happened is it's like a bunch of little birds. They're constantly going to want more out of the Sakata that's over here. Now this, of course, had happened before. All the groups can tell you that same story about being here. Is the folks back home get used to having that cash coming in, and they constantly have reasons for wanting more of it. The problem with the Filipinos is by virtue of the social interaction, the lack of distance, technologically, it's much easier to make a lot of noise about getting that stuff. Now, on top of that, on one hand, they have a constant increased expectations for what I should be able to provide. Now, we'll say that I've now worked for 7 years in Hawaii, and I've worked at one of the hotels, so I'm going to go back. So I go back to Ilocanos North province, and I'm somewhere in Baguio or someplace like that up in the north. And so I go back to my village, and everyone's like, "Oh, it's good to see you." And I brought, all sorts of stuff back for everyone, and everyone's all happy. Now, of course, in their view, I have a ton of money. So even though I was sending money back, they think I also literally came with suitcases of money, stashed away in me when I came back to them. And because I don't want to look bad, because I want to look good, I'm going to be very generous. It's part of the expectations in Tagalog and Ilocanos societies to look good so people will say nice things about you. Again, as with the other Asian groups, gossip is a hugely important function, so especially gossip of people saying nice things about you. What you also have, at least in Tagalog society, as we'll get in a second, is validation by strangers. You want strangers to say nice things about you too. But in this case, I'm back home. So I'm going to help people out. If someone says, "Oh, my car went broke," I'm going to go, "Oh, here, I'll give you some money, go get the car fixed." So I'm supposed to look generous. And basically what happens is I turn into a Santa Claus, which is oftentimes a term that at least my neighbor likes to use. So people get used to hitting me up for anything, regardless of whether I'm a relative or regardless of whether it's legit. It's just sort of like I'm just a pool of money that can be hit up with because there's that social relationship. This becomes that negotiated relationship thing. Now, not surprisingly, since I'm not working anymore, since I'm now at home, I've got limited income. I'm pretty much whatever I took over with me is all I've got. And if I want to live a decent life, pretty soon I'm going to have to start telling people no. But they're not going to be happy with the word no, especially if I'm in the process of maybe building a house, or I'm trying to get myself set up or start a business back home or something like that. They're going to be thinking, well, Bordner suddenly turned really stingy. He used to help all of us out. He used to be really generous. Now he's saying no, but he's still building this house. He's trying to start a business. And so they're basically pissed off because all of a sudden the tap starts to dry up and Santa Claus has got no more presents in the back of the, whatever the hell, sleigh or whatever the hell Santa Claus runs around in. The bag's empty. And they're going to be really unhappy with that. And all of a sudden, what was nice comments about what a generous person he is, now it's going to be, oh, Bordner's really stingy. He doesn't like to share. Yeah, I'm pretty sure he has 3 or 4 suitcases full of money under his bed. He just has decided to get really, he doesn't like us anymore, and da 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 da. And he's not really a nice guy. And he was all bullshitting us and blah blah blah. All that nice gossip has now turned really negative. And this is one reason why you see the circular migration. It's going to be a lot easier for me after 5, 6 years in the Philippines, and I burned through what I took back. And people now start to diss me for the fact that I'm not being as generous as when I first went home. It's going to be a hell of a lot better for me to come back to Hawaii. 2 things. One is I'm generating revenue again, so I can send money back. And secondly, because I'm not there, people are going to diss on me less because now money showed up again. The minute I go back again, it's going to be the same thing. Santa Claus is going to show up, increased expectation of goodies. And when that slows down, then people are going to give me a hard time. I have 3 of my friends, all from the local Sud province, who when they went back to the Philippines intentionally did not move back to their village. They all moved from pretty much the central west coast, and they all live actually in 3 villages near each other on the east coast. I can't remember if it's Ormoc Bay or wherever it is. There's a big bay on the east coast, which has a huge number of according to them, and I'm pretty sure they're probably right, of Sakatas from that worked in Hawaii. They find that when they finally move back to the Philippines to retire, which is what they all did, is they can't afford to be around the village, because if they do, they get hit up all the time. So they actually moved it's got to be at least 300 miles east to the eastern edge of Luzon, into areas where pretty much everyone's like them. So it's really difficult for their relatives or other people in the old village to hit them up for stuff because they're not nearby. That's a very intentional move. This sort of Santa Claus view of the folk from Hawaii is very typical one of remittance economies in general, but is very typical of the dynamics that you see with this circular migration of the Filipinos here to Hawaii or the mainland US, back to the Philippines, here to Hawaii, mainland US, back to the Philippines, is because of this set of demands that are constantly escalating that you can never satisfy. And yet people have no tolerance for the realization that you're limited. I know, people aren't dumb, but once you start giving stuff, people are always going to think they should get stuff. Now, one of the things that is very different, I'm going to put this on the Spanish because I don't think this is part of Tagalog. My suspicion is not part of Tagalog society. It's a little bit in Ilocanos, but more Tagalog, and that makes me suspicious that it's actually part of the Spanish import. Because if you're ever grown up, and again, I grew up in a Mexican neighborhood, if you're ever grown up in a Spanish-based system, one of the things that becomes really important, especially to guys under the age of maybe 100, is how strangers see them. It's oftentimes the word, and it's a bad word in some ways, but it's the word you see technically used by sociologists to be machismo, which if you use it in its original Spanish form, means the way that people identify or see me. If you want it to, my public face, my public image, how I'm presented in public. But it's also tied to it as the concept of a very fragile ego. So if I go out in public, I'm on stage. I'm constantly performing because I want people to be impressed and have the right view of who I am. So but the key here is it's not people that know me. People that know me aren't going to be impressed by my performance because they know me too well. It's people that I don't know being impressed by my performance. Now, Anglo-American society has very much the same thing, and I don't know if that's because of negotiated relationships or what. I think it's the Calvinists personally. So this idea that what strangers say about you can actually be in some cases more important than what family can say about you. And I'm sure that if you're from Anglo-American society, you can actually think of cases in your own family history of people where when strangers diss on someone, the family are unable to comfort them because the person's more upset about what strangers said than what family said, which to someone like Chinese or something would be like totally weird that you'd have that sense that strangers have more relevance to who your identity is than people who know you. Tagalog society has very much the same thing. How you're viewed by people you don't know and probably will never meet is really, really important. So one of the side effects of this then is you do this as an Anglo-American society through conspicuous consumption. So having things that are highly visible, and especially highly visible in terms of their perceived value, is really, really important, especially for male identity in Tagalog society. And of course, that gets passed on over here. And in fact, that's one thing that the Cicadas complain about, is a lot of the money that's sent back home goes to stuff that's not even relevant to like education or food or clothing or something. It goes to stuff to make the guys in the family look good so that they can impress people they don't know. This gets stereotyped in a whole mess of ways over here, but the key thing about this, and this again is typical if you grow up in Latin America society, it's the same thing. It's this idea of social public image, which is much more prevalent among men than women, is highly ritualized. In fact, where I grew up with it, we used to call it the rooster. Guys, the slang for Mexican guys between the ages of roughly 10 when they first figured this out till the time they were about 150 was this, oh, they're being a rooster. You dress up really nice, you go out somewhere, you want to be seen. If your car's there, it has to be styled out. Everything about you is like, da-da, notice me. But it's a very staged, very calculated performance. And there's a lot of stress involved. So among other things, there's going to be a lot of competition between guys for who's putting on the best performance. So it's more like one of those, like America's Most Wanted, or one of the, no, I guess that's not right, one of those talent show things. You've got to be the best in the group. You've got to be the most striking to strangers. It becomes a major part of the dynamic of self-image. And what then sort of gets lessened is the idea of the family. If you think about it, that's also where then the compadre becomes so powerful. The compadre doesn't care about the performance, they care about you. So they're interested in the real you, not the performance of rooster you. So Filipino society is a very complicated dynamic, and it varies very much from group to group. Ilocanos have the compadre. They have some of the concept of the sort of ritualized, machismo, social public image, whatever you want to call it. But I don't see it quite to the same extent, though I think that's changing. As Filipino society is becoming more sort of universalized, I think you're seeing this expand to a tremendous extent. But it helps to explain a lot of the stereotypes of Filipinos. Color, flashy stuff, which is oftentimes, of course, part of huge stereotypes, is actually sort of a twist on a goofy exaggeration of this idea of being noticed becomes a big thing that's highly important to this group. Now, the only way you're going to see this in most cases, if you guys were in the education system, we'll say that you're teaching. Oh, perfect. It'd be 8th grade. It'd be what? Oh, I should have picked 8th grade. Was that we'll say, well, 14-year-olds. I don't know what 14-year-olds would be. We'll say 8th grade or 9th grade. I don't know, whatever 14 would be. That's a good age. So you've got a class of 14-year-olds, and we'll say that a fair amount of that population is fresh off the boat Filipinos. In other words, they're Filipino kids who came over probably with their parents. They've been in the United States for 4, 5, 6 years. On one hand, they're definitely what they are. On the other hand, they're trying really hard to be accepted as local. But one of the things they're going to have, is especially the guys, is they're going to have a pretty good dose of this sort of rooster attitude. Now, how is that going to be a problem in the class if you're a real, let's say you're teaching math and you're a real disciplinarian type. You want kids to memorize, I don't know what the hell kids memorize when they're 14, but we'll say that you want to memorize stuff and they got to pay attention in class. Where are those guys liable to be a problem in class? Because you have to remember, the main thing they want is they want attention. Why is your class going to be really hard for them? Hopefully we don't have a lot of education majors that are trying to think they want to rethink their major now. Think about something, you got 26 students in a classroom, all the classic classroom, all sitting looking forward. You're the teacher in front doing your slide presentation like this, and you're talking about some math principle. And all the students have got to be there paying attention and listening to you because you try to explain this stuff because it's complicated. Why are those guys liable to be a problem?
Mr. Bordner, I don't really understand the question. Could you
Okay. Okay. So you're teaching 14-year-olds. Okay. So the public school. You've got a group of students. We've got, say, 3 of them are Filipino 14-year-old guys. So they're heavily involved in this whole sort of idea of ritualized public display. And so one of the major things in that age group is you've got to be noticed. Now you've got them in a classroom where they're supposed to sit quietly and pay attention and follow what's going on. What's actually their main agenda with their 26 classmates? I'll give you a hint, it ain't math.
Being noticed?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, they want to be noticed. They want people to be paying attention to them. They want to be, they want to be the center of attention. If they could, they'd be in front of the class with 26 people paying attention. Now, to do that in a classroom, how are they going to do that?
I guess be loud or something like that.
Yeah, they're going to be loud. They're going to start acting up or something like that because, in their view, being noticed is what's really important. And in their sense of self, and especially this idea of validation, it needs to be constantly reinforced by outsiders. So the 26 other students in class are perfect. On one hand, they sort of know them. On the other hand, they're a diverse mix. They're not all Filipino, they're local, all sorts of folks in that class. And they sort of know them a little bit because they're in school together, but they don't know them really well. So it's a perfect group to be validated by. So there's enormous pressure on these guys to do that. If they don't, remember, they're going to be dissed on other folks for not doing it. So it's not like it's a real option for them. They sort of are trapped. They've got to be noticed. Now, in that context, if you're the teacher, say Sarah's the teacher, what's the problem she's going to have as they're trying to be noticed? Where's there going to be very quickly sort of a conflict of roles here? Visualize the classroom. We'll say that I'm one of these guys, so I'm acting up because I want to be noticed. Why is Sarah going to have a hard time? She's the teacher. What's her agenda for this 45-minute period?
Just to teach them while their agenda is to get noticed?
Yeah, we've got a total disconnect in terms of what's important. And the more that she, starts to give me crap and say, you've got to be quiet, you've got to behave, then the more that I'm going to start to act up because I want to be noticed. And to do that requires that, that people give me that attention. But in her view, how come my chat's not showing up here? Oh, here it goes. Yeah, it's totally taking away from her teaching. Boy, you got that totally right. Yeah, and as far as I'm concerned, if Sarah's the teacher, she's thinking, shit, I'm losing this. Not only am I losing this guy who's acting up, but he's now competing with this. I'm trying to cover this complicated math problem, and here now I'm losing all 26, like sand slipping through my hands. So she's gonna have a very little tolerance with this, and she's gonna just, the more she tries to sort of call him out or set him down and sort of sort him out, the more now it's gonna become like a game because now she's paying attention to him. And because she's the power figure in the classroom, because she's the teacher, the more that if I'm that guy, the more I'm going to actually sort of play off of that because that's actually doing exactly what I wanted. I've now not only got my 26 classmates interested in me, I've got the teacher interested in me. Now, if you think about it, that's sort of a bad short-term solution because now I've also got a teacher pissed off at me. And given the fact that the dynamic of an educational system is the teacher's in charge, pretty soon the hand of God's probably going to slap down on me. I'm going to find myself in a vice principal's thing or, set aside for some sort of detention or something like that. And I'm going to start to be labeled as behavioral problems. But I don't have behavioral problems. It's a value system. In my age group and the group I'm a part of, I have to have that attention. If I don't, everyone's going to dump on me because I don't do it. So I'm caught in a situation where if I'm part of that group, this is not an option. Now, in many cases, what you find as individuals, certainly we did this when we were growing up, is you find other places to do that so you don't have to do it in a classroom. But, if you haven't figured that out or those options aren't available, then the classroom becomes the only place you can be on stage. And this is one of the things you frequently see in the educational system. If you look at DOE, it's discussions about discipline issues with kids, especially guys acting up. And they sort of treat it as if it's the same, regardless of what the background is. But I would argue, depending on the background of the individual, it might be really different in terms of why that person's acting up. In some cultural situations, it's not really an option for that individual. That certainly would be true, sort of in Tagalog society. Or if we had more folks from, say, Mexico or someplace like that, you'd see that very much the same thing. And I know because that's what we did in school. That was the system I grew up in. And machismo, in some way, shape, or form, public image, is really, really important. It really dominates your world and your sense of who you are, because everyone else scores you on it. They score you vis-a-vis everyone else in terms of whether it's better or worse. And oh man, that the teacher just dumped on your ass and you didn't do anything about it. And you just lost points. You just lost social cred tremendously. So stereotypes of not being able to fit are oftentimes based on things like social values. And it's important to remember, especially for guys in particular social situations, and Filipinos are just the first example we've sort of seen this, that idea of public image is really, in many ways, has to be the most compelling thing, because that's basically the way that they self-image. That public image is also how they self-identify. So, for example, in that group, and this, I grew up in this, is that being good in school doesn't give you any points. Being noticed in school makes you a lot of points. So in that situation, it might be short-sighted and it's a dumb attitude. So be it. No one said cultures were smart. But it's important to remember that when you're looking at dynamics and they seem to be in conflict, it's oftentimes about the basic agenda items are different. It's not the Filipinos, Filipino guys think that school's lousy. It's just if school has to be tied in competition with self-image, then self-image is always going to win out, because that's who you are. It's going to be more important than learning technical material from a professor or a text or whatever it is. So just sort of something to think about when you look at different societies. If you think about, it's a very different attitude, for example, of an educational system that someone who's Japanese or Chinese would have, where your self-identity is totally not of interest to strangers, and you're not interested in what they think. So getting ahead educationally is so dominant, it would never occur to you to act up in class, because you would just like, why? It'd be like someone speaking Latin that wouldn't make any sense to you. Okay? So when you're looking at local classrooms, especially the classrooms you guys might teach if you're an education major, that's one of the reasons you have this tremendous diversity in behaviors, is because the social underlying logics that people operate under are very, very different, depending on their ethnic identity, which in most cases includes the values and attitudes of the group that they see themselves being a part of. And groups that are then fresh off the boat are going to be stereotyped differently because they might have more aggressive versions of a set of behaviors. Filipinos, again, because of the numbers that are recent migrants, are one of the groups that are most visible this way, but they're certainly not unique in that regard. It's true of almost all the groups. And you see this a lot, for example, Kaimoki High, at Jared Intermediate, stuff like that, if you ever worked down there. Okay, so I think I got through that. Probably went over a bunch of stuff way too fast. Okay, any questions or comments? Anything?
Can you see the difference in like education, like in Hawaii, because of this compared to like the mainland?
Oh, sure. The interesting thing is, you go to the mainland, if you were teaching in some place like, say, California or Arizona, someplace like that, you'd find that same discussion would be had, but it would be folks from Mexico, Guatemala, etc., what they would call Latin Americans or Latinos, or oftentimes seen to have educational issues. But again, it's gender-based. The women in the classrooms will not be generally, discipline issues or competing power issues. It's going to be a guy thing. But yeah, the mainland, yeah, and again, you have to remember, it's not necessarily the cultures they came from. It's not if someone's Azteca or Tolteca or Guatemalan, Mayan or whatever. It's the Spanish. And it's the same thing with the Filipinos here. The guy attitude, the rooster attitude, is a reflection of 300 years of Spanish basically saying this is what it is. Because if you want to see this a lot, go to Spain. Spain is a trip. And Spanish guys are basically just giant roosters with egos, as far as I'm concerned. It's the French attitude towards the Spanish, and the French, in essence, have attitudes too. My niece used to dance in Barcelona for a while, which she's way too familiar with the Spanish. And Spanish guy, she just rolls her eyes. So this is a Spanish thing. Spanish imported this as part of their cultural package. And yeah, it's in the mainland, it's a different group in terms of where they're from, but they're all from the Spanish heritage. So you go blame the Spanish, but yeah, you'll see the same thing. It's different dynamics because, of course, in the mainland, you're not going to have as diverse of a student population in the classroom. And you don't have, in most cases, unless it's certain parts of maybe California or something, you're not going to have a large Asian component in the classroom. So there's different dynamics in terms of the percentage of the mix, you might say. But, in fact, a good example, just sort of in passing, when I was a senior in high school, we moved up to Oregon, so we're in Portland. And in the school I was at in California, maybe a fifth of the population was Asian, maybe a quarter was Latinos, and it was a very diverse African American. So it was a very diverse population. When I moved up to Portland in the suburbs, it was 1,000-person high school. There were 3 Asian folks, and 2 of those were twin girls. 14 African Americans. They had their own high schools. It was totally segregated, and the entire rest of the population was basically Haole, with the exception of a few Indians. So I mean, it was really weird, and that's so if you're teaching there, you got a totally different dynamic because your population core is entirely different, which I don't think people think about when they come. But it's one reason why teachers move here to teach from the mainland. Oftentimes have a really hard time here because the diversity here just really throws them for a curve. They're not used to the dynamics in the classroom. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Okay. That's it.